My name is Megan Bell, and the following is a presentation of my capstone project, A Safeguard for All Sectors, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. Accounting scandals such as Enron, Tyco, and WorldCom have proven that a lack of governance leads to increased risks, including fraud. Understanding the impact that this increased risks has on investors and ultimately the economy, the United States government passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act was implemented by the Securities Exchange Commission in 2002 and contains guidelines for corporate and criminal fraud accountability, white-collar crime penalty enhancements, along with other subsequent sections. Since its implementation 17 years ago, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act has improved internal controls, reduced fraud, and increased financial reporting accountability for the public sector. Despite its success, nonprofit organizations have yet to fully adopt its governance. Full adoption of the Act by nonprofit organizations would improve reputations as reliable and transparent organizations, increase donor confidence, and increase corporate donations, and possibly increase funding from the government. Failing to adopt the Sarbanes-Oxley Act leaves nonprofit organizations exposed to an unnecessary increased risk, which could result in the organization's dissolution. Nonprofit organizations consist of few to many individuals, but are not owned by any one individual. Nonprofit governance responsibility is vested in the board of directors or trustees. Even with the billions of dollars, hours, and people involved, the nonprofit sector relies heavily on trust and trusting relationships between organizations and donors. The government has established a few laws to help deter fraud and ensure legal appropriations. However, nonprofit organizations are not held to the same internal control or financial reporting standards as the public sector. According to the Urban Institute's National Center for Charitable Statistics, in 2015, 1.56 million nonprofits were registered in the United States. The sector composed of 5.4% of the United States gross domestic product. It is estimated that over 25% of the adults in the United States contributed an estimated 8.8 billion hours volunteering in 2017. Also in 2017, over 410 billion was donated to charities from individuals, foundations, and businesses. According to IndependentSector.org, the United States is home to 1.6 million tax-exempt organizations, and the nonprofit sector is responsible for 10% of the American workforce, or 11.4 million jobs. Probing into the risks the sector faces and searching for reasons why once successful organizations go belly up, the nonprofit risk book scanned the field in search of clues, and examples began to emerge with alarming clarity. Numerous instances were found where nonprofit organizations, large and small, failed to heed warning signs. Organizations assumed that they were too small, too large, or too well run to be harmed by risks. As the nonprofit risk book's findings presented, it is very apparent that the current nonprofit governance structure needs an overhaul. Providing an immediate solution is the adoption of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. In response to accounting scandals in the public sector, such as Enron, Tyco, and WorldCom, the United States Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which was executed by the Securities and Exchange Commission in 2002. By imposing strict regulations of financial reporting, record-keeping, and auditing practices, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act holds publicly traded organizations to a higher standard. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 realized risks and sought to provide solutions. Solutions like increased transparency, regulating internal controls, and mandating financial statement responsibility. With guidelines for corporate and criminal fraud accountability, white-collar crime penalty enhancements, along with its subsequent sections, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act is vast and comprehensive. The Nonprofit Risk Book outlines 6 risks that are in strict contrast to those carried by for-profit, publicly traded enterprises. The first is multi-year government contracting with flat funding. This risk identifies a non-relationship between expenditures and funding. In other words, even though the cost of doing business or providing service is increasing, the funding an organization receives remains the same. The second is complexity of program eligibility requirements. This risk complicates the identification of people who are approved to attend programs or to even use the service. Requirements of funding matches, which necessitates nonprofits to cover basic operating expenses for services otherwise supported by a government contract. Increasing costs of doing business. As mentioned previously, nonprofits often have flat funding. So when that is coupled with the increasing business costs, a nonprofit could be forced to spend more than it is bringing in. One of the others is a growth in the demand for service that exceeds the organization's ability to react. The last is rigorous performance requirements to operate. From advances in technology to the need for data analytics or quality improvement activities, nonprofits are forced to keep up with the change, but they are not reimbursed or compensated for doing so. Nonprofit organizations are complex environments that are managed to a mission. By focusing on a mission that allocates resources and activities to serve constituents or causes, executives somehow believe that the organizations are being protected by the good things that they're doing. This belief is referred to as the blind spot. Organizations can lose sight of their underlying businesses and operations and operating environments. Falling in this blind spot increases the likelihood of missed warning signs and exposes the nonprofit to more risk in general. In the public sector, mitigating business risk is not a choice, it's a requirement. Through the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the Securities and Exchange governs financial reporting, record keeping, auditing practices, and holds companies accountable for their internal controls. Portions of SOX, like whistleblower protection, document retention, and destruction guidelines, apply to nonprofits. However, their compliance is voluntary. BoardEffects.com states that most nonprofit organizations are required to register with their states and then are governed primarily by that state's government. Requirements vary from state to state, and for this reason, many donors, executives, and advocates for the nonprofit sector feel uneasy and exposed to risk with their inconsistencies. Increasing insecurities are the statewide budgetary restrictions that hinder the pursuit of unethical nonprofits. As the 6th risk of rigorous performance requirements touched on, in most cases, it is up to the organization to pay excessive amounts of their funds to follow through on compliance obligations. This strain of compliance has forced nonprofits to regulate themselves. Sector-wide, it is a hope that with the large number of nonprofits competing for grant monies and donations, nonprofits that fail to meet regulations and to follow best practices won't likely be able to sustain themselves financially. Relying on a hope and trust to guide behaviors is certainly a risk. As history has proven, competition leads to unethical behavior. Adoption of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act by nonprofits will provide solutions to many of the risks that the organizations face. SOX Section 802 provides criminal penalties for destruction and altering of documents. Compliance with this section would demand nonprofit organizations to formulate a document retention policy. Implementing such a policy would enable nonprofits to set forth the timeliness for maintaining various categories of documents. This would also prove itself useful when defending against violations, but also providing the ability to produce supporting documentation to ease donor concerns. The importance of a nonprofit's reputation and increasing donor confidence can make or break a nonprofit's success. A poor reputation in the community most often means funding deficits and negative spending. Section 302 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act requires the organization's CEO and CFO to take corporate responsibility for financial reporting. This increases donor confidence by requiring top executives to certify that the financial documents are true and a fair representation of the organization's financial position and the reporting is free from internal and material misstatements. Advancing confidence further is SOX's requirement for audited financial statements by an independent auditor. Another set of independent eyes certifying that the financial statements are free of material misstatements. While it is understood that the business model of a nonprofit organization differs from that of an organization in the public sector, it is proposed that nonprofit adoption of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act would result with the same benefits that the public sector experienced. Compliance with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act is proposed to yield improved reputations as reliable and transparent organizations, improving donor confidence, attracting more corporate donations, and furthering funding from the government. Since the Sarbanes-Oxley Act has yet to be implemented by nonprofit organizations, their actual results of compliance with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act can only be hypothesized. Grundy and Nizina suggested that the adoption of the Act is likely to result in any one or all of the following hypotheses: better financial controls, reduced risk of financial fraud, enhanced effectiveness of the board of directors. Possibly the most beneficial effect of compliance with SOX for the nonprofit organization may be an improved reputation as a transparent and accountable institution. Facilitate contracts with the government, facilitate more private donations, increase fundraising capabilities, and obtain more resources to meet their clients' needs. Nonprofits would incur costs with implementation of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Although the exact cost has yet to be calculated, unintended, the effect of adoption of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act on nonprofit organizations forecasts that the costs should be lower than those of the for-profit corporations, stating that certain aspects such as compensation to the board of directors does not exist in most nonprofit organizations. Cost efficiency is something that all businesses strive for, especially when it comes to implementation of new processes, much like those that would come along with SOX compliance. Because nonprofit organizations are already restrained to guidelines that surpass budgetary allocations, one might argue that nonprofit organizations are far from prepared to absorb implementation costs. A strategy to managing the costs of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act implementation is to implement in phases. Spreading of implementation costs over a period would settle the initial financial impact. It is important to remember that although SOX brings new challenges and some headaches to companies, it has contributed far more to corporate excellence through more robust internal controls for financial reporting, increasing investor confidence, and a greater appreciation for discipline, transparency, and managing corporate responsibility. It is also likely that with increased donor confidence, that increasing government funding would follow. A nonprofit's exposure to fraud risk is just as great as the public sector, but they carry an even bigger responsibility to their communities. Nonprofits are designed to help those in need or to further a narrative that provides for the greater good of diverse communities. In short, nonprofits benefit communities, and those communities are looking to nonprofits for support. A result of this direct relationship, it is crucial that nonprofits maintain accountability, transparency, and a good reputation within their communities. According to nonprofitrisk.com, beyond the immediate financial loss, an even greater potential cost of fraud to nonprofit organizations is the reputational damage that can occur. Because most nonprofits depend on support from donors, grantors, and other public sources, their reputations are among the most valued of their assets. After the accounting scandals in the public sector, investors were left questioning all stock valuations and the public was left shaken. The SEC knew the market was in trouble and the public wanted answers. Designed to promote transparency, accountability, and corporate responsibility, it is safe to say that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act has made drastic improvements. Nonprofits have a duty to the public, and their reputation serves as the public's mean of evaluation of those services provided. Just as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act served to improve investor confidence in the public sector, full adoption of the Act in the nonprofit sector would improve donor confidence and strengthen the organization's reputation within the community. As David pointed out in his article, A New Imperative in Nonprofit Governance, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act provides a basis for increasing awareness within the sector itself that nonprofit institutions need to pay much closer attention to their governance structures and practice if they individually and as the sector as a whole want to continue to enjoy the confidence of their constituents. While it is easy to point out the positives that would result from the adoption of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, there are also some negative implications. As previously mentioned, nonprofits operate with limited funding, and the ability of a nonprofit organization to provide services within the community could be hindered by any increase in costs. Even with the utilization of cost savings implementation strategies, it is possible that even the initial cost of implementation would be great enough to impact the organization enough that they could no longer offer certain programs to the community. According to AccountingToday.com, the implementation of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act has forced public companies to be more disciplined. A result of this increased discipline has been the significantly reduced numbers of reported restatements. As Audit Analytics covered, the 671 reported restatements in 2016 were the lowest reported in a decade. By further defining the role and responsibility of an audit committee, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act allows the committees to continue to hone their capabilities and enhance their financial reporting. A research study was conducted by Versa Systems in cooperation with PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP on the benefits of public company compliance with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. The results of the study were as follows. An increased understanding, effectiveness, and communication of business processes, revealed internal control weaknesses that were potentially damaging, established more effective risk management, reduce fraud, and finally, increase the effectiveness of the board. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 was designed to govern public for-profit organizations. Although many sections of the Act could also be applied to nonprofit organizations, some sections do not apply to nonprofits in totality, and other sections would need to be amended to better suit the needs of nonprofit organizations. It is possible that these sections could be amended prior to the adoption, but it is likely that through implementation, other areas in need of further amendments would be identified at that time. This process could prove frustrating and time-consuming for organizations that already struggle to find employees and volunteers. Another barrier to implementation would be the cost of doing so. Like I said before, it is hard to identify an exact price tag because doing so is still an unknown. Because nonprofit organizations operate under strict budgets, an increase in operational costs could be detrimental to its ability to offer services to the public. Identifying early on that the benefits will outweigh the costs, many lawmakers have already taken steps towards adopting the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. According to Hewitt and Associates article, Sarbanes-Oxley and Nonprofit Governance, lawmakers in several states have introduced legislation mirroring the broad goals and in some cases, specific provisions of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. A few of those examples are, in California, they enacted the California Nonprofit Integrity Act of 2004. It's been effective since 2005, and it stipulates that all nonprofit organizations with $2 million or more in annual revenues have to have an audit prepared by an independent firm. New Hampshire also passed a law requiring organization revenues in excess of $500,000 to submit audited financial statements with their Form 990s. Several other states like Connecticut, Kansas, and Maine have also passed similar laws to that. Although implementation will come at a cost and it may prove to be difficult, it is important that nonprofit organizations understand that compliance with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act can only increase the potential for improving donor confidence, which, as we mentioned, would result in increased funding, as well as the possibility of increased funding from the government. In conclusion, with all its positive benefits, it's clear to see that the nonprofit sector should adopt the Sarbanes-Oxley Act to minimize risk, deter fraud, and improve internal controls and increase investor confidence. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Have a good day.